Gremminger, aka the OG Fantasy, back at it. I'm recording this a little later in the day on Tuesday because of the Jonathan Taylor news. Wild times. I was ready to do, this video. I like to record it, get it out of the way, so I can get it out bright and early. But Zach Moss is available in 50% of Yahoo leagues. Like, this is one of those, not in my league, bro. He's not available in any of my leagues either. But if Zach Moss happens to be available in your league, it's time to make it rain. Jonathan Taylor is going to be out 2 or 3 weeks, and that's him getting thumb surgery with the hope that he can be back in 2 or 3 weeks. So this is not like a guarantee. And, we never want to say, anything would ever happen poorly, but there's a chance for setbacks when it comes to this. Like, this is a franchise running back. This is a player who Indianapolis invested a ton of money in. This is not somebody who they're going to be very short-sighted with their decisions. And I get it. This has been a season where Indianapolis loses Anthony Richardson, and then they admirably, keep it going with Minshew behind center, and they have themselves in a position where they can be an AFC playoff team, but not to like their long-term detriment. They're still getting back Anthony Richardson back. So again, Zach Moss is available in 50% of Yahoo leagues. If you're one of the fortunate ones who he happens to be available for, then go nuts. You cannot keep holding fab with the thoughts that, hey, when I get to the playoffs, maybe my league still has waiver wire runs. I'm just going to be able to bully that team in a 1-week season. Like, Zach Moss was unbelievable when Jonathan Taylor was out. You're talking about Zach Moss, who was legitimately putting up RB1 numbers. It's the guy was getting the receiving work. He was getting the all of the 3 down work essentially. And if you look at the PPR scoring lists, even right now, Zach Moss is still outscoring a lot of backs that you would think hey, this guy must be outscoring Zach Moss by now. But Zach Moss was so productive at the beginning of the season. He's still up there in fantasy scoring. Moss gave you a 20-point week, a 22-point week, a 33-point week, an 18-point week, a 14.5-point week. And then this past week, in a limited role, gets 8 carries, 55 yards, and then 2 catches for 15 yards. So he gets you 70 combined yards this week. So off the cuff, get it out of the way. If Zach Moss is available, this is as big of a waiver wire addition as you're possibly going to find. But, again, he's probably not available to you in your league. And it's too bad because this is a bad week for waivers. I get excited about talking about deep names and trying to be impactful to people that play in some really, really hard leagues. I get a message from my friend Joey Brown today, who plays NFFC, and Joey's in the top 20 for the NFFC primetime. And he says that this has been a real help to him reading our waiver wire column at Player Profiler. Joey's top 20 right now to win 250 grand in the NFFC, and he's able to find names that helped him this year in this waiver wire column. So shout out to Joey, who's been a supporter of the work we're doing. But I think there's a lot of people who are benefiting from this column in this video. And it's not to pat myself on the back. I think there's some other people out there putting out strong waiver wire content. But I think with us, we're able to give you names that have been available in deep leagues and names that maybe we were a week ahead of. A lot of guys we seem to have been a week ahead in our rating. And one guy who we were ahead of was Jaden Reed, who I begged people to add for weeks and weeks. And it was sort of a disconnect with the fantasy community and Jaden Reed, where they didn't necessarily want to add him as an upside stash. And maybe it was because there's so many pass catchers in Green Bay. Maybe they didn't really have faith in Jordan Love or thought this would be a run-oriented team. But for whatever reason, I keep a threshold of guys in this waiver wire column that I write and also this video where I like to look at guys who are 25% or less rostered. It's just a clean number. If somebody's available in 75% of Yahoo leagues, then he's probably available to like a lot of the people watching the video and reading my column. But Jaden Reed always stayed in that like less than 25% no matter what. So I had to keep writing about him and writing about him. And now finally you're starting to see him ball out. Jaden Reed is 1 touchdown behind the lead for all rookies. Jaden Reed scored again on Thanksgiving. And Jaden Reed is in a position now where legitimately, if you're ranking players, Jaden Reed is somewhere in the mid wide receiver 3 land. He's very much a flex for you, no matter, the depth of your league. So Jaden Reed, hopefully you added him just like we wanted you to add Josh Downs for a bunch of weeks before he popped. We wanted you to add Tank Dell before he was a big waiver wire addition, Devin Singletary. Like, I'll do a review video kind of at the end of the year to talk about, the hits. And I think that this year has been a year for the grinders. Like, if you put in the work this year, if you really hit the waiver wire hard, you're in a position to be not only in your fantasy playoffs, but a real factor in it. This has been a year where so many players have made big impacts off the waiver wire. We had Trey McBride one week as our number 1 tight end ad. A couple weeks back, I had Pat Freiermuth as a top 10 ad. I was able to pick him up in some NFFC leagues myself, and he just smashed this past week. He's not in this because he's rostered in too many leagues now, but, Kyron Williams this past week went insane. Kyron Williams looks like maybe a top 3 to 5 running back rest of the season. We talked about him right here on this video and in this column. So this has been a great year for waivers. There's been a lot of guys who have come off of waivers and hit. That's not going to be every single season, but I think we were able to identify a lot of them, and hopefully you're in great shape to not only make your playoffs, but in a shape to potentially win a league. And never take that for granted. This is a game where if you're in a 12-team league, you got to be first out of 12. That's not a given. Even if you have the strongest roster, when you get to a head-to-head format, when you get to a championship game, anything can happen. You get to the semifinals, anything can happen. You can have a quarterback get knocked out of the game, and you're done. So don't take it for granted. If you're an opportunity to win any of your leagues, this is the time to grind. This is the time to get after it. Spend some extra time this week. Got 2 more weeks of the regular season. If you're in an FFPC league, you're in the playoffs right now for a number of these formats. But if you're in a Yahoo or a sleeper, your fantasy playoffs are right around the corner. This week could be the week that determines how strong your bench is moving forward. So time to get after it. Again, not a great week. And also we got to deal with the dreaded Bye-Mageddon Part 2. How on earth we get 6 teams on bye week in week 13 just seems like fantasy cruelty. I have one team which is just completely demolished this week by buys. When you're sitting there and you're drafting, you hate seeing these late buys when you're drafting a guy, but you're like, whatever, it's going to be week 13. I'll be okay. Well, I might not be okay. I have a league where I have Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, and DJ Moore, Justin Fields as well. And I also have CJ Stroud. So I'll be okay at the quarterback position, but it's just like, you feel like you're done. This week is going to be hard for me to overcome losing all that firepower, but you've got Baltimore, Buffalo, Chicago, Las Vegas, Minnesota, and the New York Giants. So you have multiple teams with a great deal of fantasy relevant players in that mix. New York is really the only one where you feel like you're only losing Saquon Barkley, but the other teams have multiple guys who are either locked in starters or potential starters for you. So really tough one to get by. And then we also want to be a week ahead when it comes to the waiver wires. So next week is Arizona and Washington, which is very sneaky because Kyler Murray and Sam Howell are right on that QB1 line. So both of those guys got to prepare for make sure you have a quarterback pivot for next week, week 14. And that's pretty much it. Then after that, we're in the fantasy playoffs. We're done with bye weeks. So hopefully you survive the bye weeks this year. But this week is absolutely bye week hell. Why don't we start out at the quarterback position? And again, my threshold is players who are are available to me in 75% of Yahoo leagues, or they're listed as a shallow league ad. And I'm going to link my article. If you're watching this video, please check out the article as well. We love to have people take a look at the work we're putting out on the written side at Player Profiler. Check out some of the other writers as well. We've got some really, really strong work, and it definitely helps us out when you give us a read. So let's start at the quarterback position. Let's talk about shallow league ads. Jordan Love just passed for 3 touchdown passes. He's available in 48% of Yahoo leagues. Green Bay, of course, beat Detroit on Thanksgiving Day. Really a fun game. Green Bay was in control of that game the whole time. You talk about Christian Watson's really coming on. Jaden Reed, we just talked about him. Romeo Doubs has been, very strong in touchdown receptions this year. So Jordan Love is like very much on the streaming radar. If he's available in your league, I'm very confident in grabbing Jordan Love for the stretch run. Green Bay's in the mix if they win out to make the playoffs, and I think that they view themselves as a playoff team. You also have Matt Stafford. Matt Stafford is available in 52% of Yahoo leagues. He only passed for 229 yards, but he had 4 touchdown passes. And with Kyren Williams back, this Rams offense is pointing up. Definitely check your waiver wires for Jordan Love and Matt Stafford. I also think Derek Carr is a stronger addition than anybody else I'm going to talk about, despite some of the limitations that he has. He's available in 56% of Yahoo leagues. So talking about lesser rostered quarterbacks, guys that I think are going to be available to you in a lot of leagues, we're starting with Kenny Pickett. And this is a guy who I've been like dunking on for a lot of the season, but I got to keep it real. Matt Canada, first game, not there. Kenny Pickett goes out and passes for 278 yards. And for Kenny Pickett, 278 yards is a lot. Like, this is a post-Matt Canada bump, potentially. I don't think Kenny Pickett is great, but I think that the fact that Pittsburgh did whatever they could to stick with him is like internally they have some confidence in Kenny Pickett. So to me, that means he's a guy that at least Mike Tomlin sees as a potential long-term starter. We don't necessarily see it, but I think Tomlin sees it that way, and Tomlin knows a lot more football than I'll ever know. So Kenny Pickett, first game without Matt Canada, gets 278 passing yards, and he was attacking the middle of the field, which was something missing from Pittsburgh. If you watch them, everything was kind of on the perimeter early in the season, or dump offs to the running backs out of the backfield. So they're really attacking the middle field. Pat Freiermuth is healthy. Deontay Johnson and George Pickens, both of those guys can play. The fantasy production hasn't been there. And then the two-headed backfield of Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, Kenny Pickett's got a couple of weapons. I think there's a chance he's like a mid QB2 rest of the way. He's definitely one that I want to monitor the next few weeks. Got to stick with my guy Gardner Minshew. And Minshew hasn't really done anything recently. But I think with Jonathan Taylor out, you could see the offense looking slightly different. Maybe a few more targets for Michael Pittman, and a few more targets for Josh Downs. And Zach Moss has been pretty strong as a receiver out of the backfield. So Gardner Minshew is a guy that I was really excited about for some of the season, and it's kind of let me down. He's really reached a level where he's a low-end QB2, very much a purgatory player for you. You kind of know what you're getting with him. You're not going to have spike weeks. This past week, he did pass for 251 yards and a touchdown, and he faces off a beatable Tennessee secondary this week. So Gardner Minshew, if you're in a complete jam. Will Levis has not passed for 200 yards in 3 straight weeks. Like, that 4 touchdown game against Atlanta feels like it was 5 years ago at this point. Tennessee was kind of firmly in control against Carolina. They end up winning 17-10. Wow, that play at the end of the game where they were like 4th and 6, 4th and 7, and they run a screen pass, that was about as bad as it gets. But anyway, Tennessee controlled that game. The big dog ran for 2 touchdowns. Levis didn't really have to do anything. He does have a chance for stronger fantasy numbers in week 13 against Indianapolis. And again, you have 6 teams on bye. So I don't really want to play him, but I'm not like scared to death of playing him this week if I had to, based on the fact that we're missing 6 teams this week. Got to talk about Aiden O'Connell. Aiden O'Connell is one that I think is very much on the Superflex radar moving forward. He passed for 529 yards over the last 2 games. And after the Week 13 bye, he faces the Vikings and he faces the Chargers. These have been 2+ matchups for quarterbacks. I'm like kind of intrigued by Aiden O'Connell. And if you have an opportunity just to stash somebody, go ahead and stash with them. So again, Kenny Pickett, my favorite quarterback ad of the guys that I expect to be available to you. Now, running back gets a little bit ugly. Roschon Johnson, though. Roschon Johnson last night did some things that make him, the number one waiver wire ad. And I think that there's potential that this doesn't work out, that this was matchup based, and that this is the way that they wanted to attack the Vikings, was using the running back out of the backfield as a receiver. But Roschon ends the game with 10 carries for 35 yards. Not great, but he out-carried Khalil Herbert 10-6. And again, Roschon Johnson, very good in pass protection. So that could have also, played into that Herbert versus Johnson usage. But then the passing game, Roschon catches 5 balls for 40 yards. So he gives you 75 combined yards. And then in PPR leagues, gives you that extra 5 points with his receiving work. So Chicago goes on bye. Deonta Foreman's banged up. Khalil Herbert's back from injury. And Roschon Johnson has, one of his best games in weeks. I'm still going to be aggressive for Roschon Johnson because running backs don't grow on trees. Self-scouting matters. Chicago may want to see what they have in Roschon and say, listen, rest of the season, we want to give Roschon an outsized role. He's shown flashes of talent. Let's see what we have here. And maybe we don't have to address the running back position this offseason. Like, the two-way ability protects Roschon Johnson. So I'm going to be aggressive with trying to add him in waivers. If he's available in your league, go out and get him. We had him last week as a top 5. I believe I had him 4 overall last week for our waiver wire rankings. This week, he moves up to number 1. He is still available in 77% of Yahoo leagues. So go for Roschon Johnson if he's available. Now, if you want a lottery ticket edition, Jeff Wilson is it. And the next running back we're going to talk about, basically the next 2 guys are lottery tickets. So Roschon Johnson, I would expect, is going to have some value to your fantasy team, whether that's a RB2 and he's starting for you every week, or whether that's a RB3 and he's kind of a flex. I think he'll be somewhere in between that. I'm hoping that he's going to be a weekly RB2 who's getting the usage. But the next player we're going to talk about has the contingent upside to be a smash pick in the fantasy playoffs, and that's Jeff Wilson. So Devon Achane was unable to go in Miami's Black Friday win over the Jets. And then Wilson saw a substantial workload. Wilson gets season highs in rushing attempts with 11, rushing yards with 56, and total touches with 14. Gives you those 3 catches. Like, the story of maybe the fantasy season is Raheem Mostert right now. Raheem Mostert had 2 more touchdown runs. Raheem Mostert is on like a collision course to set the Miami Dolphins all-time record for most rushing touchdowns in a season. But we've seen it with Devon Achane, and then we saw it with Jeff Wilson this past game, that Miami's going to mix in a second running back. It happens all the time. Now with Achane, he looks like the league winner. Wilson's not necessarily that, but he's got a bunch of paths to fantasy viability. If Devon Achane misses this week again, you can put Jeff Wilson in your flex against Washington. I think Miami's going to be in control of the game. We just saw Washington get stomped by Dallas. Dak Prescott eating turkey legs on the sideline was one of the coolest and most disrespectful things you're ever going to see from an opposing quarterback. Just unbelievable. But Washington's in a bad spot. Miami might stomp them. And Jeff Wilson, I think, could see another 14 touches if Devon Achane misses. Now, if Achane plays, you still want to have Wilson on your bench because this is such an effective attack with the running back position in Miami that I want pieces of this offense whenever I can. Then you also have the fact that what happens if Raheem Mostert misses time? And I don't want to, if you have Raheem Mostert, you don't want to hear that. But again, like Raheem Mostert has been doing it all season long. If he misses some time, though, even if Devon Achane is fully healthy, you're still going to see that second running back mixed in, and that's Jeff Wilson. Now, Jeff Wilson, if Mostert misses some time, might turn into more of like an 18 touch a week guy with some goal line work. So Wilson has contingent upside. If either of the two running backs on Miami miss time, he is viable. And we want pieces of that Miami offense. Rico Dowdle. I talk about Rico Dowdle every single week, and it's getting a little tiresome because Yahoo managers just do not want to add him. Ask yourself this: if Tony Pollard went down for the season, where would Rico Dowdle be on? I mean, talk about other sites that maybe have a 50% threshold of guys they list. Maybe they'll go with more shallow league kind of ads. But if Tony Pollard missed, Rico Dowdle would be one of the biggest waiver wire additions of the season. Rico Dowdle would be a guy that you'd spend 100% of your fab left in. So why not add him now and keep him on your bench for cheap in case something happens to Pollard? Like, we've seen Dowdle play well. He scored another touchdown this past week. And if Tony Pollard missed, Dowdle would be a top 15 play every week. And based on the quality of the Dallas offense, Dowdle might be a top 8 to 10 running back every single week. So Rico Dowdle available in 88% of Yahoo leagues. If you don't need to fill your lineup this week, go get yourself some Rico Dowdle. He'll also be a little bit under the radar because there were some other running backs that might be, more in demand this week. Another running back that I think kind of slides under the radar is Royce Freeman, especially if you're in a deep league. Kyren Williams goes nuts. Kyren Williams has 2 touchdowns, runs for 150 yards. Kyren Williams looks like the league winner, but Royce Freeman is getting mixed in and used consistently the last 2 weeks. So even when Kyren Williams puts up a ridiculous fantasy number, Royce Freeman still gave you 77 rushing yards and a score. This is back-to-back weeks of 70 rushing yards for Royce Freeman. Now, if Kyren Williams has a setback, the way Royce Freeman is playing, he's a locked-in mid RB2. When Kyren Williams is playing, though, Royce Freeman is a guy that if you're in a complete jam at the RB2 spot, you could throw Royce Freeman in. Or if you're in a complete jam at flex and you say, hey, I really want 10 points, maybe Freeman could fall in the end zone again, you can use him as well. So contingent value, and also maybe he's a handcuff plus moving forward. And then sticking at the running back spot, another guy we got to talk about, something's going on in Jacksonville where Travis Etienne is playing less snaps than he previously played. D'Ernest Johnson has had 17 touches over the last 2 weeks. And we talk about what would happen if Tony Pollard were to miss time, how you would treat Rico Dowdle. Well, D'Ernest Johnson is the handcuff in Jacksonville, and this is a solid offense. And Johnson also has pass-catching ability. So Travis Etienne briefly exited Sunday's win with a chest injury. If the injury were significant, we would be talking about D'Ernest Johnson as this incredible waiver wire addition this week. Now, Travis Etienne dodged anything. He finished the game, and he saw a huge volume. But again, D'Ernest Johnson has been cutting into the snaps. He's been getting work as a receiver. And again, you're talking about a handcuff, but a handcuff that could really, really pay off if Travis Etienne were to miss any time. Another guy who's sort of a handcuff plus is Samaje Perine. I was really into Jaleel McLaughlin, but it's time to move on because Perine has passed him by. Perine ran for his first rushing touchdown in week 12. And then in week 11, he had 7 catches. So for back-to-back weeks, he's done things that were, very intriguing from a fantasy perspective. He's the handcuff to Javonte Williams, but he could be turning into a handcuff plus. We talk about Kenneth Gainwell a lot here. Kenneth Gainwell is available to you in 73% of Yahoo leagues. Clear handcuff to DeAndre Swift. Rashad Penny was inactive. Gainwell you can't use unless there's an injury. But if there was an injury to DeAndre Swift, Gainwell would be a locked-in starter for you no matter what league you're in. Latavius Murray. We got to talk about Latavius Murray. So Buffalo goes on a bye week. No one's running the ball well. Latavius Murray gets a little bit of extra work in the passing game because James Cook dropped a would-be touchdown pass early. So Latavius Murray, first of all, the game was a 37-34 game. So it was high scoring, back and forth contest. And Murray had a few extra receptions than he usually would. He finishes with 48 combined yards. James Cook turned things around. James Cook ends up with 6 catches, but no one on Buffalo ran well besides Josh Allen. So I'm still going to roster Murray to see what happens out of the bye week. We could talk about Leonard Fournette, though. Fournette is available in 87% of Yahoo leagues. No Buffalo running back ran for 3.3 more than 3.3 yards a carry in Sunday's loss to Philly. So, like, no one's being efficient running the ball. And we've seen that in many games here. So I would anticipate that James Cook just handles it after the bye week, but self-scouting, a team that needs wins, Leonard Fournette could be a lottery ticket for you. Again, the guy was a top 12 play at the running back position last year and was even better the year before. Michael Carter, if you're in deep leagues, 98% available, and the game flow helped, but Michael Carter had his most promising game as a Cardinal. He caught all 4 of his targets, and he outcarried Amari DiMercato 4-3. Speculative addition for deep leaguers. And then we'll just talk about some handcuffs. Elijah Mitchell, Zamir White, Chase Edmonds, Matt Breida, Josh Kelly. These guys are all available in somewhere between 99% and 83% of Yahoo leagues. So if you have a team that you like are going to make the playoffs, and one of those guys I listed is the backup running back to your starter, it's time to have less fantasy depth and more fantasy protection. Depth does not matter as much the deeper we get into the season. You know, having that guy that, hey, maybe I'll flex once in a while is cool, but having protection to a running back position is even better. Like, if I have DeAndre Swift, I need Kenneth Gainwell. I won't feel good about it if I don't have him. Think about a Jonathan Taylor manager today. You had a window in trading leagues to go and get Zach Moss for weeks. Should have done it. And it's hindsight's 2020. And again, there's certain fantasy analysts who don't like handcuffing because they think it limits the upside of your roster. But again, having the upside of the entire roster is less important when we get to the fantasy playoffs. If I am in the first week of the fantasy playoffs in a normal league, it's me and 5 other managers, 6 total teams. One more week, there's only 4 teams. Then I get to the championship, just 2 teams. So the depth does not matter as much like the overall depth. But if I have invested in a specific running back, having a chance to have that handcuff, I really want to do it. So if you have Rachaad White, go roster Chase Edmonds. It's not great, but if it was a 1-week absence, Chase Edmonds could give you 12 points and you might be able to get through it. If I have Josh Jacobs this week, Josh Jacobs getting 20 plus carries every single week, just roster Zamir White. You know, you're invested in the position as much as anything at this point. Let's pivot over to the tight end position. Tight end is kind of a fun one this week. We don't have a Isaiah Likely to discuss. He's now rostered in like 50% of Yahoo leagues, but Cade Otton is still available in 71% of Yahoo leagues. So a little bit over our threshold, but we should talk about him. He continues to deliver like low end but consistent PPR production at the tight end position. You're never going to be like excited about Cade Otton, but Cade Otton is the sort of guy that you want to have as like a tight end 2 in a deep format. He has had 4 catches or more in 5 of his last 6 games. It's very consistent. We know what's going on with the Tampa Bay offense. Mike Evans is a stud. Rachaad White is a stud. Chris Godwin is like a low-end wide receiver 3, looks kind of dusty. And Cade Otton is getting, 4 catches a game. So he's a tight end 2, and he showed a ceiling when he had a 6 catch for 70-yard and 2 touchdown game against Houston. So, like, every now and then, if you're getting that sort of consistent volume, you have a spike week. It's just a natural progression. So I don't anticipate spike weeks for Cade Otton, but if you're in a jam at tight end for the rest of the season, he would be the preferred add this for the season. Now, if you need a tight end only for this week, it's Juwan Johnson. Juwan Johnson was successful last year because he caught a lot of touchdown passes. Now, this year he hasn't really done it. He missed some time with injuries. You've had the Taysom Hill factor. for a couple weeks where he was doing well for the New Orleans tight end. Then Juwan Johnson comes back from injury. We've talked about him here on this video and in my column a couple of weeks, but now he has kind of a golden opportunity. New Orleans faces Detroit in a game where you have to anticipate New Orleans going to have to put the foot on the gas a little bit against that sort of explosive offense, especially with Detroit coming off of a loss on Thanksgiving. Detroit has a longer period of time to prepare for New Orleans, and they're really going to come out swinging, I think. So New Orleans, you have Chris Olave likely to miss with a concussion, and then Rashid Shaheed, who would be the natural next man in terms of a number one target. He's dealing with a thigh injury. You have Michael Thomas on the IR, and you have Juwan Johnson, who could end up getting, a 7-8 target game, a very kind of a one-off high volume game. During the preseason, they talked a lot, like the New Orleans beat reporters talked a lot about the connection between Derek Carr and Juwan Johnson. We haven't really seen it. Maybe we see it for a 1 week against Detroit here. And I think Juwan Johnson's a good enough player to roster, even if it's for the rest of the season, because he could pick up as the season moves along. But for 1 week, Juwan Johnson is the preferred tight end streamer this week. He'll definitely be in my sleepers video. Look for that on Thursday or Friday, right here on Player Profile YouTube. And make sure you're subscribing and liking these videos. It definitely helps us out. And then let's talk about Tucker Kraft. Tucker Kraft went against that same Detroit Lions defense that I just talked about with Johnson on Thanksgiving Day, and Tucker Kraft scores a touchdown. It was early in the first quarter, and he sort of trailed off after that, but he still did find the end zone, his first career touchdown catch. And there's been a little bit of kind of optimism for Kraft the last few weeks. Now you have Luke Musgrave on the IR, and I think things are kind of pointing up for Kraft. He's got a difficult schedule over the next few games, but week 15, he has a promising matchup against Tampa Bay. I think you could do worse than Tucker Kraft. This was a guy who was a very productive player in college. Like Luke Musgrave, he was a day 2 selection, so he has some pedigree. And again, he caught a touchdown pass on Thanksgiving Day. And we talked about Jordan Love earlier in the show. Jordan Love is kind of trending up. So maybe you start seeing Tucker Kraft catching a little bit more passes. He's had at least 2 catches, or excuse me, he's had a couple of games in a row with 2 catches or 2 targets, a few games in a row. So it's been minimal volume, but with a young player finally getting a few games under his belt, just catches a touchdown pass. Maybe we start seeing that turning into 5 targets, and then that might end up being something. Again, Tucker Kraft below Cade Otton, below Juwan Johnson for sure, but definitely a speculative one. Tyler Conklin, got to talk about him. Every week I have to talk about him. This is our favorite break glass in case of emergency tight end option. Jets offense is struggling, but Tyler Conklin now has at least 5 targets and 4 catches in 3 of his last 4 games. So again, he's sort of like Otton, but he has less of a ceiling than Otton because the Jets offense is a absolute train wreck right now. But at least 5 targets and at least 4 catches in 3 of his last 4 games. He is not a low ceiling guy. He's a no ceiling guy, but he is a low floor safety blanket. And your matchup this week is shady. Maybe you're using Dalton Kincaid and you don't have any good options behind him. Go with Conklin. Greg Dulcich. This is a speculative addition. He's due to come back soon from the IR, and the Denver offense is trending up. So if you want to kind of sneak in one and just kind of see where it goes, it's Greg Dulcich. Got to get over to the wide receiver position. The wide receiver position is definitely the deepest one this week, as it usually is. And we got to talk about shallow league edition. No-brainer ad, Demario Douglas. He's still available in 64% of Yahoo leagues. Obvious ad. And in even more shallow leagues than that, Jaden Reed is still available in 52% of Yahoo leagues. Both of those guys are no-brainer additions over anybody I'm going to talk about here. If both those guys are available in your league, you can turn this off and just take them. But let's talk about a couple guys who I think will be available in your leagues. Talk about a shallow league addition, Curtis Samuel, but he's just over our threshold. Samuel is available in 72% of Yahoo leagues. So he's 28% rostered. We like 25% and below, but he's available in some of my leagues. So I want to discuss him. He had season highs of 12 targets, 9 catches, and 100 receiving yards in Washington's demoralizing loss to Dallas. Samuel led Washington with a 27% target share. He's kind of a must-add this week unless you can get Roschon Johnson, because Curtis Samuel has another kind of plus matchup this week against a Miami Dolphins team, which is going to cause Washington to pass. They're also going to get pressure on Sam Howell, and Curtis Samuel is sort of a safety blanket. He can do a lot of stuff right around the line of scrimmage with low ADOT catches. So if Miami's going to bring the heat, put the pressure on Sam Howell, then you have the game flow of Miami potentially putting a number on Washington, Washington having to play keep up. Sam Howell is a very capable quarterback with a number of QB1 weeks under his belt. This is another week you can use Curtis Samuel. So the only negative about Curtis Samuel is they have a week 14 bye. So this is not a guy you can add and start the next 2 weeks. But if I need to add a starter out of the guys available that I'm talking about today, it's Curtis Samuel for me. And I'm pretty confident in saying that. 12 targets, 9 catches, 100 yards on Thanksgiving. And now he goes up against Miami Dolphins defense. They're going to need a lot of Curtis Samuel this week. One guy who might be sliding under the radar in your leagues is Joshua Palmer. He's eligible to return from the IR this week, and his arrival is like much needed. LA is struggling big time, and they cannot find consistent pass catchers besides Keenan Allen, who's just ripping it up right now. Quentin Johnston's disappointing, and now he's also dealing with a rib injury. As soon as Palmer's ready to go, I think he steps right back into his role as like the secondary target on this team. In weeks 3 through 8, Palmer had 4 games with 7 or more targets. I think he's a low-end wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 4 as soon as he comes back on the field for the Chargers. It's funny, like Quentin Johnston, it's just not happening. And we talked about Josh Palmer as a waiver wire ad early in the season, and now things are coming full circle. He might be rostered in your league. Like, I know a lot of people held him through this IR spot, but you really never know because, managers have to deal with things like bye weeks and injuries, and you can't hold too many zeros. So, again, Josh Palmer is available in 73% of Yahoo leagues. Now, one guy who's going to be available everywhere is Greg Dortch. Greg Dortch is available in 98% of Yahoo leagues. I don't want to try to talk him up. This is a guy who was completely invisible to start the season. And then Kyler Murray comes back and Greg Dortch steps in for an injured Michael Wilson. And all of a sudden, he's been targeted 17 times over the last 2 weeks. You cannot ignore late season target increases. Like, you just can't. I remember a few years back, 2021, where a guy who crushed it in championship week for fantasy managers was Braxton Berrios. Braxton Berrios had 12 targets in championship weeks and 8 catches, and he caught a touchdown. And a few fantasy managers I know had the stones to put Berrios in their lineup, and he delivered. And you can go back into the box scores for like the last 5 years. There's always a few guys who get volume increases or target increases, usage changes, and they become viable in like week 16 and 17. So I wouldn't bet on it, but I'm not going to ignore a guy who's getting 17 targets in 2 games from a quarterback who I think is good in Kyler Murray. So Greg Dortch, nobody's going to be excited to see and say, whoa, man, that's an awesome addition. But that's a one where if he's getting this sort of target volume, I want to consider having him on my roster. Another guy who's seen a major increase in terms of production is Justin Watson. And this one's a little different because Watson had 11 targets in week 11. And then in week 12, his targets dropped to 3. But he found the end zone in both games. Rashee Rice has completely come on. Travis Kelce is Travis Kelce. And Isaiah Pacheco is balling. But I don't think Justin Watson's a thing. But I think Justin Watson, like, if I have dead weight on the back of my roster and I can cut a guy that I don't think is going to ever do anything for me and put on a Patrick Mahomes wide receiver who's had 2 touchdown catches in 2 weeks, I'm going to consider doing that. And maybe you're putting Justin Watson right back on the waiver wire in a week if his target volume, stays at 3. But if he goes from 11 targets to 3 targets, then up to like 7 targets this week, you have to kind of start looking at him and say, this is a guy that Kansas City's starting to use a little bit. So I'm kind of adding Watson in a few spots, and I don't think he's going to cost you much fab despite the 2 touchdown catches. Now, one guy who, if I don't need anybody this week, I like adding Jalen Hyatt, and I want to be optimistic about Jalen Hyatt. I've had these moments on this waiver wire show and column where I've talked about Jalen Hyatt, and it sort of hasn't happened. But this past week against New England, in a 10-7 game, he ends up with season highs in targets with 6, catches with 5, and he has 109 receiving yards. And he has receptions of 29 yards and 41 yards. So Jalen Hyatt has the speed, and the Giants need some goodwill for the rest of the season. Like, it's been a disaster of a season for the New York Giants. Tommy DeVito under center. Now the Giants go into a bye week. If I'm self-scouting, I want to see what I have in Jalen Hyatt. I do. I want to go and I want to say, for better or for worse, we're using Jalen Hyatt. Again, the guy just coming off 109 receiving yards. Go ahead and pick up some Jalen Hyatt this week. Got to talk about Marvin Mims, but I don't want to gas him up too much because I've been let down by Sean Payton multiple times this year. But Marvin Mims finishes with 35 total yards in Sunday's win. And gosh, like we're actually talking about 35 yards from Mims because Mims is a stud. Like, if Mims was getting 8 targets a game, I have full confidence that he would be doing a lot with them. We've seen him flash. This is a guy that we like the prospect profile of. Just hasn't happened. I don't know if Sean Payton just doesn't like him, doesn't trust him, but just is not using him. But we're starting to see him pick up a little bit. Gets 35 total yards, gets a rushing attempt and a couple of catches. He's had back-to-back weeks with 3 targets. I don't want to gas him up. I'm gonna get hurt again if I try to paint a picture of Marvin Mims becoming fantasy relevant. But if you want a lottery ticket, keep Marvin Mims on your bench. Maybe you see Denver utilizing him. But again, we can't trust Sean Payton with this one. I think on the bright side is I'll be drafting a lot of Marvin Mims next year when his ADP doesn't rise, and he could potentially have a year 2 breakout. That's at least what I'm telling myself. Then talk about Jameson Williams. Jameson Williams keeps flashing with like very low end fantasy production. He's had 95 combined receiving yards over the last 2 games, and his snap share has been 50+% for 2 straight games. If we treat Williams like he's a rookie and not a second-year player, we would start getting a little bit excited about this. If you recall, he didn't play a whole lot to end last season. He was injured as a rookie, ends up not producing at all to end the season, and then this year has the suspension to start the season. So he's missed a ton of time with either injuries or off-the-field incidents, but we're starting to see him get 50% plus snap shares. So he's another kind of lottery ticket guy with contingent value. I do think if any of the big 4 Lions miss time, I think that they would potentially get a few more looks to Jameson Williams a game. That's, and I could be completely off on that one. That's just my read on things, because when you look at this roster, Sam Laporta, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then Jahmyr Gibbs as a receiver out of the backfield, and David Montgomery as a high-volume running back. If Montgomery misses more time, Jameson Williams now has had more experience, more snaps under his belt, and a higher percentage of snaps played. Then if Amon-Ra St. Brown misses time, God forbid, if Amon-Ra St. Brown misses time, you could see a few more targets for Williams. And if Jahmyr Gibbs misses time, maybe those dump-offs out of the backfield turn into more wide receiver targets. So I'm kind of painting myself a picture where I want to roster some Jameson Williams. I don't want to have 0 if I'm a high-volume player, and he's available in 88% of Yahoo leagues. Jonathan Mingo, train wreck in Carolina. Carolina cleans house, fires Frank Reich, fires Deuce Staley. If you didn't watch the interview with the Carolina owner, Tepper, the dude gives like no confidence in like the state of the franchise. Like, you watch this guy, he's not a likable guy. He doesn't deliver very well. Talks about the decision with Bryce Young over CJ Stroud. We're going to talk about this all offseason. Carolina is in a bad spot, but this is a team where Jonathan Mingo has now had at least 6 targets in 3 straight games. Much like Jalen Hyatt, it serves Carolina to try to see what they have out of their second-round wide receiver for the rest of the season. Adam Thielen had a poor game this past week, but Adam Thielen is easily the number 1 target in the offense. Jonathan Mingo is the number 2 target in the offense. Now, a number 2 target should be fantasy viable, but Carolina is an absolute train wreck. But if Jonathan Mingo's targets start going from 6 to like 8 or 9, then that's a guy we can start considering. Again, I don't have Mingo in the top 10 this week on my overall, but he's a guy that's available to you. If you want a younger player whose role is increasing with draft capital, that's certainly Mingo. Another player, a young player that's going to be available everywhere because he's been hurt, is Michael Wilson. Michael Wilson, again, they have the week 14 bye. So this is a long-term play. And it could be a depth play at this point because we don't have a whole lot of season left. But I was excited about Michael Wilson in an offense with Kyler Murray. He gets 6 targets in Murray's first game back, and then he gets hurt. Was unable to play this past week. If he comes back, he's going to go up against a Pittsburgh secondary that I think can be beat. So Michael Wilson would be like a speculative ad. Put him on your bench, see if he plays in week 13, and see if the usage is there to make him worth rostering for the rest of the season. Khalil Shakir, talk about him every single week. He's on a bye. He's going to get cut by a lot of managers in your league. But if you're in a deep league, he gives you exposure to the Buffalo passing game. A player who I'm actually pretty excited about, but didn't make my top 10, available in 100% of Yahoo leagues, is Cedric Tillman. 3rd round pick this past draft. And when Donovan Peoples-Jones was traded to Detroit, it created a path to Cedric Tillman to get on the field. Now you have a path where Cedric Tillman could be on the field the entire game. Amari Cooper suffered a rib injury, and if he misses time, Tillman, I think, is a full-time player opposite Elijah Moore. Tillman had career highs of 4 catches and 55 receiving yards in Cleveland's loss to Denver. He's definitely an interesting player to keep an eye on. I like when these younger players start getting a late season opportunity. Sometimes we can find fantasy success there. And if you're a dynasty manager, especially in FFPC leagues, see if Tillman's out there. He might flash to end the season. Talk about like a throwback. Hunter Renfrow was completely buried under the stadium, basically, in Vegas with Josh McDaniel. You're talking about Hunter Renfrow, who 2 seasons ago was a wide receiver 1, was like the most random wide receiver 1 season ever, but he was still a wide receiver 1. Then Josh McDaniel just starts burying him. Last year, Renfrow was like a huge dud pick in ADP, like crushed teams who took him. Devontae Adams and Renfrow were looked at as a pairing that could thrive with one another. It turned out to be Renfro's a 0, and Devontae Adams is going to get targeted like beyond belief, has a career high in targets. Then this year, Jacoby Myers is brought in as a free agent, and you have Devontae Adams being drafted as a 2nd rounder. Then Jacoby Myers was drafted as like a 10th, 11th rounder, depending on your league. And then Renfrow completely left for dead. There were some people still drafting him like the 19th, 20th round, just hoping maybe he gets traded. Then Renfrow does nothing for the season. Like, they were playing the rookie Turner over him for a time with McDaniel. McDaniel gets fired, and immediately we see Renfrow start to be fantasy, not viable, but at least, back to catching a few passes. Hunter Renfrow now has 9 catches in the last 2 weeks. Vegas has a chance to self-scout during the bye week. I don't think Hunter Renfrow is going to be fantasy viable for the rest of the season, but it's still interesting. If you're in a very deep format, he might be like a 5-catch-a-game guy for the rest of the year. You're talking about a guy who a few years ago, Derek Carr was just completely leaning on and peppering with targets. And Renfro's not like some old guy either. Like, this is a guy who it's just wild to talk about Hunter Renfrow. And now this next name, Rashad Bateman. Rashad Bateman is available in 82% of Yahoo leagues. This is a speculative addition to see what happens down the stretch. So Mark Andrews gets hurt. and Bateman starts to see an uptick in usage. He has posted snap shares of 70 plus in back-to-back games. So earlier in the year, Harbaugh talked about how Bateman will start seeing more playing time as he gets healthier. Well, he's starting to get healthier and starting to see more playing time. That has not led to any fantasy success, but the snap share is relevant. 70% of the time he's been on the field for 2 straight weeks. Now they have a chance to go self-scout. If you're in a very deep format, definitely take a look at Rashad Bateman. Again, he's no help to you this week because of the bye. This is a long-term addition. A.T. Perry. Now, some people have A.T. Perry like way higher up than I do in the waiver wire rankings. But I have A.T. Perry. I'm just not expecting a ton. I know the coaching staff likes him. I think this is going to be more of a Alvin Kamara and Jawan Johnson game. But if you think I'm wrong, A.T. Perry could be an every snap wide receiver this week for New Orleans against Detroit. Again, A.T. Perry played a lot of snaps now for 2 straight weeks. And I'm expecting that Olave's out, and I think Rashid Shaheed's going to be out. So especially if Shaheed is out, A.T. Perry is viable. He's a guy I'm going to talk about a little more later this week in our sleepers video. And that's it. This has been a lot of fun. We went a little bit longer than we usually do on this video because it's fantasy playoffs times, man. This is the time to really get your roster in top shape. This is the time to put in the work, spend extra time on the waiver wire. For some of you, you might have 2 weeks left of the regular season, and that's it. So put everything you can into it to make the fantasy playoffs. And if you are in a position to get a bye week, you got to go nuts this week. Like, start looking at your opposition, especially in a smaller league. Like, if you're in a regular 12-man league at this point in the year, look and see who has fab left. Certain teams you can box out and block them from getting a guy who could really help them out. And that's really about it. Appreciate you watching these videos. Smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, read the article that I'm going to post right under here in the show description, and stick with us here at Player Profiler. Check out press coverage with Jim Coventry. I recorded on Tuesday. Check out First Class Fantasy. I am going to be recording with Billy Muzio on Thursday at 3:30. Sonic Truth Dynasty Podcast. Me, the Podfather, Alan Soslowski of RotoWire on Friday. And then Dynasty Life, my Dynasty podcast. That's going to be on Friday afternoon with Scott Connor of Dynasty Trades in 5 and Destination Devi. Been a pleasure all season long. I hope you've been able to add some of these players. I hope you're in a position to crush your leagues. And let's get it, man. Time to make some money.